Hi everyone, this will hopefully be a short video, I hope. I want to just briefly respond to your first essays, the COVID diaries. I'm not finished with looking at all of them because it takes me about a week to get through a batch of papers, which includes my other classes. So some people have gotten responses. When I grade electronically, there's an uneven timing for when people get feedback. So I should be done with all those papers by the end of the day tomorrow. But so far, I just want to say I admire your resilience and your amazing coping strategies and your willingness to finish all the things that you had to start as a high school student or whatever you were doing. And I mourn with you your last rites of passage. I'm sorry that that happened. And I just hope for better times, or at least just more fun times. I'm sorry for those who endured illness, family stress, and family unemployment. A lot of you decided to get a job or get a new hobby, and all of you said, let's just get going and stay going somehow. So a good amount of you said that you wanted to share your papers, and I will curate those papers and we'll get back to volunteers. And that might take me a while as I sort through everybody's name because I don't really know people yet, per se. And today I just wanted to show you a picture of John Price, whose diary you're going to read, and then this is his members of his fraternity at Phi Gamma Delta in 1918 at Denison University in Granville, Ohio. So as you can see, some of these guys have their military uniform on. So probably, as you've read, these folks did not fight in the war, but probably in the Student Army Training Corps. John Price, a sophomore at the time, was in the Student Army Training Corps. He also got the flu, and both his brothers were fighting in the war at the time. We're looking at his life mostly because he left a big record, but his experience definitely shows a pivot in American culture after World War I. There was a lot of anger and cynicism among young people after the war. So although the U.S. entered World War I late, there were a lot of casualties in general in the globe among young people in the war. It was a very bloody war. Plus, as you've read, in organizing all the troops for the war in the U.S., they put all these young people together in close quarters, and many of them got the flu, and that was a vulnerable demographic. Also, the World War II was allegedly fought among Christian nations, and so after the war, there was cynicism about what it meant to be a Christian. Do Christians fight war? There was also young people who were fighting the Victorian status quo, and particularly behavior around gender norms. So we're going to be reading about suffrage, and the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920. So this was a transformative period. We can guess that we're entering a transformative period, and we don't know how. So when figuring out why someone like John Price became such a party boy, not to give it away, but he started to have a lot of fun after this, it's one practice in reining in our maybe impetus to be presentist, and that is to judge people in the past. I would like us to think about people in the past as an other who we need to understand, another culture, people who aren't like us, and that we need to really get in their heads and get in their shoes. Just like we may need to get in the shoes of someone in our contemporary culture who's not like us and try and figure out the way they act the way they do. It also make it help a little bit how culture shapes our own experience. Since we went through this profound change together, and particularly members of the class of 2020, it's not hard to recognize how culture shapes behavior. So looking at the past can help us, but I think with you guys, you're pretty well equipped for that. We will be using historical comparison as one form of analysis, particularly the next paper, but I just want to point out a little bit the limits. So although I think it's very interesting to look at the pandemic of 1918, I have been troubled by too much comparing. And that might really conflate fear and also maybe false predictions about what's going to happen with the COVID-19. First of all, the Spanish flu was much deadlier than COVID-19. It hit young people very hard. There were very few doctors in the U.S. There really wasn't modern medicine yet. And most of the doctors were out fighting the war. They were abroad or somewhere. but not, everyday modern hospitals. Many people did not have running water to wash their hands and to be sanitary and to so-called social distance, although we are hearing that we got the ideas for social distancing from this period. I'm just a little bit skeptical that this was an en masse enterprise, just knowing that people just didn't have the modern conveniences that we have. We've also had other pandemics that have been less studied, like the Hong Kong flu, which I encourage you to look into. That might be more of a comparison. So also with the Spanish flu, is people are predicting that there's going to be a second wave, but COVID-19 is not the flu, it is a coronavirus, and the last two coronavirus pandemics did not result in a second wave. So we can study and compare, but I think it can help us, comparisons can help us in some ways, I would say in some ways be skeptical of comparing, right? Comparison has its limits. So stepping back from that and contradicting myself, I do think in some ways what we can learn from the Spanish flu is we knew when people were over it, like in the sense that they didn't want to worry about it anymore when the war ended. And that was after the end of the peak of the flu. So I wanted to just introduce you to, it seems to have lost it, an article that I really thought was very interesting, and I should have assigned it, so I'm going to give it to you as a supplementary article. And one problem with teaching the class online is if I make mistakes or I think of other things that we could talk about, I can't just bring it into class as I usually might, which is less homework for you. So this is just something supplementary I wanted to point out and encourage you to take a look at this article. You can also listen to it. So the author of this essay looks at other pandemics of the past, including the bubonic plague, and her argument is that pandemics have a cultural end and a social end. So a medical end and a social end. So a medical end might be a vaccine, the whatever virus dies out. Those things are not going to happen at the same time. So we could see the social end of the Spanish flu was the end of the war. This was something she argues. Some of these other long-standing pandemics like the bubonic plague really took a long time. So I don't think the bubonic plague is really at our doorstep. Okay, that was really, really primitive in terms of healthcare at that time. So maybe one thing to ask, just food for thought, is will COVID-19 have a social or medical end, or will the social precede the medical? If we're learning as we learned, the Spanish flu ended culturally when the war ended, but there also was really not any media hype about this. In fact, the media was hiding the Spanish flu. So that might have been a pro and a con. There was no CNN type coverage of what was going on. So even John Price, who got the flu, wasn't really that worried about it. His parents were worried, but they weren't that worried. There was a member of his community who got the flu. So even though it was happening to them, they weren't able to put all of these things into context. So one thing that made me think about in terms of comparing is ignorance bliss? Furthermore, they didn't continue to test people they didn't have the mechanism to test people after the peak of the flu. So that made the cultural ending, I think, in 1918 rational. We can get that. We can understand how that ending seemed like, for the people who are experiencing it, they could take no more of this. They didn't want to hear the story anymore, even if the story in some ways was part of their story, like John Price and his family. So I'm going to put a link to this in the module as supplementary reading, and again, you can listen to it. Let me show you. There's like it's 13 minutes of your time. I know we have no time, but if you ever are out for a walk or doing chores. So finishing up now, I'm going to be putting you in peer groups to discuss the paper. And just FYI, the Canvas peer group mechanism was not behaving in the spring, so I'm going to make sure that I just whip it into shape. And that doesn't happen again. I'll be less in a panic, and I'll have a little bit more time to figure that out. So you can converse with others in a small group about your paper ideas. So if you're really stuck about the approach of this paper and you don't know where to start, or why is my professor even making me write this, just ask yourself, if someone came up to you and said, what happened in the fall of 1918? How were colleges affected? I think you'd have an answer. I think you know. And another trick with writing a paper too is even if you don't feel like you know everything, you know enough, and you can hide what you don't know from your readers, and just really dig into the sources, which is something I'm going to really encourage, because you have so much stuff in a source, and I think that people might kind of avoid that work of digging into the source, but I think you can just do a lot with a few examples to really bring to life some of these details and issues of the time. So I'm just going to wish you continued luck with your classes and your lives this week, and hopefully I'll see some of you in office hours and also hear from you through email. So good luck.